Everybody, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Justin Marshall from Northumbria University. What are you actually professor in? What's your official professorial?
We've got a double. Yeah, so you're allowed to give yourself a title when you get a professorship. So I am craft and digital making. So I made it up.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, just to introduce Justin a bit further, I've worked with Justin when I first started research in Cambridge University. We were part of a research group called Autonomatic. Justin was also my PhD supervisor, and over the years, just done an amazing amount of research into craft and digital technology. So it's it's a real pleasure to introduce Justin and hear about his work. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's great. So yeah, it's really great to be at UE and to be around lots of kind of experimental stuff that is kind of recognizing the value of the digital alongside kind of physical processes. So I'm going to share my screen and do, I think it's probably about a 20-minute presentation, and then very happy to take some questions or comments or whatever. So I guess I may be preaching to the converted here, but really I want to emphasize in this presentation not only the kind of area of sort of digital craft that I'm interested in, but also an approach to practice-based research, which, RTD, research through design, is now becoming incredibly kind of well-established, recognized method for doing research, and kind of can hold its head around kind of other forms of established research methods. So I'm going to promote research through craft as a kind of approach, which I think has some, obviously lots of overlap with design, but I think there's also some distinctions, and also the kind of multiple sort of outputs you can get from this sort of research through craft process. So in this project, Hand Thought, there's outputs as tangible research objects, which you'll see. There's also from that developing theory, in my case, a digital craft ethos. There's a kind of situating that practice in a theoretical framework, which is, for me, embodied pragmatism. And then in the kind of aspiration that we're often given now as researchers to kind of look at what our impact is, a kind of more distant aspiration to think how the sorts of making and the thinking that it develops might impact on our the way in which we think about technological development and application. So it's kind of a spreading across of kind of outputs, as well as rather than just practice being output as practice, as it were. So Hand Thought project I've been doing for quite a number of years, on and off. It's not based on a one funded research project. It has been a personal research practice, so it has been sort of trundling along under lots of other activities I undertake, whether that's funded research projects or other sorts of research management and teaching. And again, it has this sort of mapping onto those sorts of outcomes I was talking about in general. Specifically, I'm interested in investigating what sort of opportunities there are for CNC technologies for the craft and designer maker, in terms of creating new workflows and creating work that has new kind of aesthetics. So quite kind of practical aims, but then there is this kind of, again, this demonstrating how engaging with practice and tool can generate theory, which I will come on to. And then there is a kind of an aim of situating it in a kind of debate around craft and design and the values within craft. So the digital craft ethos that I sort of developed out of this body of work, I'll return to at the end, but I thought I would sort of flag here just as a kind of an indicator of the way in which this project has made me think about the way we use digital technologies, but I would say you could say technologies in general, how it kind of there's a distinctive, I guess, approach that has a flavor that's different from say design engineering and the way in which they approach the use of digital tools and the aspirations they have for them. So I will return to that later, but I will just talk through some of the actual work. So the idea was with this project and you know, Taos in previous projects and me in previous projects and other people within Autonomatic and other people in the digital craft kind of field, combining a kind of analog and digital into a hybrid practice is what I'm interested in. And there are a number of ways that I've done it. I've been focusing on the use of CNC milling, and thinking about strategies for this sort of integration that has sort of different, slightly different aims. So this ambiguity series, which was the first one, was really kind of poking at the kind of, well, what do you mean by handmade? What do you mean? Well, where does the hand start and finish? What does the, you know, when does this sort of sense that you're being in some way inauthentic because you're being aided by machinery kind of kick in? So I was using this idea to create things that looked like they might be handmade or hand carved in traditional ways, but actually were computer cut, and similarly then using computer or in conversely using the sort of opportunities within computer cutting and the sort of tool paths that you can generate to kind of celebrate a different sort of aesthetic. So it's very old school, but I was using what's called an Anoto pen, which is it's pretty old digital technology, which is used for note taking, where you're using a very fine dot printed paper to draw on with a pen that has a camera, so therefore knows where it is and therefore can pick up and record with pretty good sensitivity the motion, your analog hand motion. So you can do obviously the same thing with iPad Pros can do it with great sensitivity, but I like the idea you're actually drawing. So when you look at the sort of fourth along picture along there where I'm actually drawing with a pen, you're making a drawing, you're not on a screen, which again I think is has a sort of a physicality of its own that I still, however great iPads are, they're not quite the same as drawing on paper. So using that to hand draw lines and then mapping those hand drawn lines onto a three-dimensional surface and then CNC milling those lines. So there's a kind of, without any loss of kind of subtlety and wobble and inaccuracy that you get from drawing something by hand, but driving a computer cutting machine with it. So you kind of got this sort of, I suppose, slightly sort of strange clash of something very accurately reproducing the inaccurate, and then conversely on the other side, playing around with tool paths in order to kind of celebrate the way in which computer software navigates three-dimensional form and works out, suppose, the most efficient way to cut surfaces. So, and you can do that by cheating the machine by saying, okay, I've got a large cutting tool in the machine and putting a smaller one, and then it reveals the way it's moving, as you can see on the right. So there is there's a real sense of playfulness in that space, of finding out what things will do, pushing the systems. And again, it's no great new knowledge to things like the work at the Bridge and the Centre for Fine Print Research, that play is an incredibly important part of kind of pushing the boundaries of digital technologies and what they're good for, and kind of pushing against this idea it's always about speed, optimization, efficiency, and kind of measures that are normally associated with kind of more engineering applications. So yeah, some examples of this thing. So you can see there is a very kind of particular kind of hand-drawn line. Some say you could do that by hand. I would say you would be quite difficult. This is oak. Yes, obviously there is carving traditions, but I think it still has a slightly ambiguous look about it. Is it hand carved? Is it not? And then the reverse on the bottom there, quite obviously digitally produced. It has incredible symmetry and kind of the opposite in terms of its kind of aesthetic. So playing around with that on a number of pieces of work, a real kind of exploration of visual opportunity. And also alongside those, thinking about two-dimensional works that I've used, where you are generating imagery from toolpaths. This is not meant to be an illustration of how tools move. It's more taking, again, as opportunities to explore the visual opportunities for creating pattern and surface texture. And also, I think if you look on the kind of the larger one on the right, the larger image, it's interesting. You can start to see the negotiations that a computer's doing. So yeah, on that slide with the close-up, you can see from, in that space in the sort of middle, the import of a hand-drawn line with all its kind of variability and sort of non-uniformity. And as I've played around with toolpath generation, the software's desperate to turn it into a set of straight lines and optimized curves. So there's a little bit of a battle going on there between what it thinks is right and what you really want to portray. And I think that's a nice, it's a nice place to play in with that kind of recognizing there's something going on within software, and it's something to either highlight, to maybe to play with and to celebrate. So those were 2D big-ish prints that I made, and there was sort of one for each of the pieces of work. And then slightly more recently, I've been working on this interference integration series, which, instead of this sort of idea of trying to kind of fool some sort of viewer into wondering whether something's handmade or digitally cut, is to kind of try and integrate or interfere hand carving with digital production. So unlike the other things where there actually might have been a CAD model, in this series there is no CAD. All there is if you kind of follow the sort of the little imagery from top left along through those lines of stuff, you start with very traditional tools, very traditional craft processes, to produce a hand carved form, in this case a bowl. You can 3D scan that. You then have a surface by which you can map a tool path onto, and then the tool paths can be, in the other ways, you can, in a piece of work, you can experiment with different tool paths and different kind of opportunities that those softwares afford. But all they're doing is just tickling the surface, as it were. It's just overlaying. So you're not trying to eradicate the hand, you're trying to overlay it with digital, other digital processes and surfaces. So it's a kind of hybridity of practice that again is looking to celebrate the opportunities of both, and to also, I think, to add a sort of there's aspect of humanity to them that I think a lot of digital production can seem a little bit anodyne and a little bit overly it's definitely manufactured. So that's the aspiration for this body of work, and these are two rust-stained oak bowls. They're about, I don't know, 30 or 40 centimeters across, basically as big as I could fit in a smallish scale Roland 3-axis mill. And on one side the hand carving is very clear, on the other side the digital has taken over to some degree, but it's still a kind of hand carved object. If you look at these, you'll go, yeah, but it's not quite symmetrical. That curve isn't the same as that. There's the kind of aspects that you'd expect from something that's been handcrafted that is still it's still physically present. And I think when you actually handle them, you get even more of a sense of that. There's definitely something I would like to believe has got a sort of a humanity to them that gives a sense of slightly not sure what's going on. And I think that sort of leans into my theory of technology, sort of moving beyond the idea of just the instrumental and thinking about it more in a sort of wider practice, which then adds other aspects of a kind of social and cultural aspects, rather than just thinking of technologies as just instruments. So again, going two-dimensionally, combining hand watercolor painted drawings with digital plotting, overlaying them, which it was a sort of, it was a process I'm quite interested in. And I do the painting first and plot later, and that kind of workmanship of risk that is so sort of embedded in the idea of craft is definitely still there. There's no, I'm using a Roland roller cutter plotter for this, so it's rolling back, if anyone's used them, rolling backwards and forwards at some speed, plotting this stuff out, and there's a sort of slight moment of kind of potential trauma as quite a number of days of painting gets overlaid with plotting very swiftly, with only a limited amount of control over what's happening when. So there's a set of drawings that I'm continuing to work on. So generally, it's that sort of trying to find a language, or beginnings of a language, or parts of a language or vocabulary that isn't quite handmade and isn't quite machine manufactured, that I'm interested in. More there. Yeah, so to come to what I'm hoping to do at the Bridge as a visiting scholar, this kind of idea of capturing physical movement of making things, capturing the swing of an axe or an adze, or even a chainsaw. Maybe now I've kind of gone up a scale, partially, is how do you capture that within a piece of work, and then when you integrate it with digital kind of cutting techniques, those things are more visible, so you can still see the cut mark below the mill mark. And to do that, you really need scale, which is what they have at UE. So I've now gone up from, you can see on the bottom there, I'm now working on pieces that are over 1 meter long and 0.5 meter wide, and bowls that are kind of 70 or 80 centimeters. So the marks that you're making on those are much more visible. And when we get to use the KUKA 5-axis milling machine, I think it'll allow us to play in that space between what is visible as digital cutting and what was left of the hand carving in a much richer way. And so that's a real, I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens there. And also possibly, as Taos was saying, there's such good video motion capture here, what it means to capture some of the movements you make while you're cutting, and then how can that be used as part of a process. But I'm really kind of want to emphasize that the last thing this craft ethos and these sorts of practices I don't want to do is some sort of reproductive workflow where we go, oh look, we can now reproduce something by hand using a tiling machine, and we can bang them out by the dozen, and isn't that great? That is not an aspiration of this research. This research it's about developing new works, but as much it's about developing an ethos that is trying to kind of push against some of that slightly I said instrumental kind of applications of it. Technology doesn't really consider what it means for us as producers, rather than thinking about people as always consumers and how can it be made more affordable, or how it can fit into a kind of a market economy. I'm kind of not so interested in that. So that's what I'm hoping to do in the next few months, is to do something larger scale, more axes on a robot, and really extend that body of work. So just to finish, so going back to this idea of what a digital craft ethos for me is, it is to kind of think about how we can measure other aspects of technology, put tools to work in ways that are not leaning into the kind of expectation you have from tradition of technological development within a kind of positivistic kind of context. So we know that technologies are great at accuracy, but I think there's a fidelity potential there, and that's what the sort of thing I'm trying to kind of unpick slightly in the work I do. You can't measure the nature of the work I'm making against whether or not it's accurate. And again, it's not quick process. It's not going, how can I make a hand carving process into a really rapid digital production? It's about that sensitive making, and it does still take time. That's not the measure that I want to put to the work. I think there's something interesting about, quite often design and engineering can be quite rightly strategic. It's got a definite problem, it sets out a way to look at it, and then it goes about that in the same way as people go to war. You have a strategy and you apply it, and that's very powerful and very appropriate in certain things. But I think craft is more tactical. It's more on the ground. It's more going, oh right, this happened, what the hell do I do now? How, this is a unique bit of wood, oh there's a knot there, how do I make my way around that? And I think there's a sort of different mindset in a craft process that's tactical rather than strategic. Again, this idea of effective rather than effective. So it's not about optimization. It's about the overarching effect that a kind of finished piece of work might aspire to, rather than going, well, that was the most effective way to produce things. You know, quite obviously, infinite repeatability is not particularly what this does. The works that produce are always one-offs. They're always a particular piece of wood at a particular time in a particular state of dryness, brought to the machine with a unique set of parameters, a unique toolpath for that piece of work. It's not something you can then go off and reproduce because it's a different context. And then sort of the idea of hands-on, and again, the aspiration for automation, so that you could, you know, right, with press go, we'll come back in the morning, or you'll just be a machine monitor, is not something I'm interested in. I've always, the stuff I worked on, it'll be a challenge with the KUKA, but I have been there going, oh, I think this needs to, we need to fiddle with that. Oh, actually, let's change that on the fly. It's not about front loading all your creative decisions to a design process and then having a kind of making process carried out at a distance. And as such, I think those new processes and stuff are really interesting, but I think it's the way in which they they interact with other practices, I think, is an interesting space. I think there's always real kind of like disruption is always the thing held up as the thing that is fantastic. Let's move fast and break things. Is actually, I think there's something in actually being quite sensitive to existing things and finding how they can be resituated. And I think, again, some of the work in the past at the Centre for Fine Print Research has been exemplary of that in terms of old print processes refinding value and other things like that. So that's my proposition, and I will leave it there. So thank you very much.